The Salty Sales Sages.
Hello everyone, welcome to episode 1 of the Salty Sales Sages. My name's Greg Grimer.
And my name's Simon Stillwell.
We're going to be talking about sales. This podcast is aimed at reasonably seasoned salespeople. From my perspective, we're going to be talking about a lot of tactics. Simon here is going to be talking about strategy.
I'll also be focused on the management of companies, so strategy and sales teams and the problems associated with building sales teams.
Right. Today we're going to be discussing, Simon, the 80-20 rule, Pareto principle, which just as a bit of a historical context, it's nearly 100 years old, actually. 1941, Joseph Pareto, a management consultant, came up with it. And it applies to all sorts of industries. And there's a cliche that it applies in sales too. Usually the cliche is that 80% of your sales come from 20% of your salespeople. Some would argue that 90% of sales come from 10% of your salespeople. But where do you think it applies, and where do you think it's useful for senior management when they're considering hiring people or judging, am I going to hire a better sales guy if I fire this guy?
I would argue that really, really great salespeople is probably more like a sort of 90 or 95 to 5 or 10%.
Do you think it varies a lot between industry in your experience? Because you now deal with more industries than you dealt with when you were running sales teams. Yeah. Now you're doing sort of more advisory. Do you think that in an industry like financial technology that we've both grown up in, it's different than if you're selling, I don't know, industrial equipment or, Boeing plane parts? Do you think that ratio holds good across all industries, or do you think it varies between industries?
I honestly, I don't really know. I haven't had enough data across other industries, but my suspicion is that it holds fairly well across different industries. Some salespeople are just very, very good salespeople. And in my opinion, they are not taught how to be that way. They're naturally that way. But the point is, you want to have a good team of people. And for the other 80% or whatever the percentage is, you want to focus on working to bring those people up so they are consistent. And those are the people that can be trained, can be improved, and so on. And you want to keep doing that, not just focus or bet on the rainmakers, okay? If you've got one of those, that's fantastic. But if you're a small company, it's often very hard and very expensive to hire someone like that.
Sometimes impossible to hire them. Because you just can't offer them what a big competitor can.
And honestly, I've had problems with real rainmakers in the past, right?
Yeah.
Where the level of arrogance that they bring becomes toxic to the team. Yeah. And I've had to fire rainmakers, the really good ones, because they are just toxic. They think that they're God's gift. Yeah. So there are pros and cons.
And in terms of where it doesn't, where does the 80-20 rule, do you think, act as a distraction and cause management to make sometimes poor or unwise decisions?
I think if you're constantly just searching for the perfect salesperson, it's going to be a distraction. And I firmly believe that actually coachability is one of the core things when it comes to salespeople. Having people that are coachable is really, really critical. No matter how good they are at sales, they need to be coachable because they're coming into a new business, if you're hiring them, obviously, and there will be things that they need to learn. Rigid individuals are never good. You need to have people that bring experience, but also are coachable and want to learn.
Is there one area that stands out to you when you've coached and taught people that says most people benefit from learning that thing? Because you started by saying that salespeople are born not made to some degree, but is there one area that coaching really makes a difference to most salespeople?
I like to think that salespeople, really good salespeople, are very good listeners, right? That's the single most important thing I think a salesperson needs to have. But I think salespeople can be coached in terms of listening and asking the right questions to deliver the value that the client needs by focusing on what they're actually requiring.
The one area I found that you can coach salespeople and it benefits them is for them to listen to how they sound to other people. Often I'm dealing with salespeople who are making cold calls and prospective calls, so I'm dealing with the earlier stages of the sales. And that people often come across as sounding like salespeople. There's not enough natural personality coming across to them. And I say you wouldn't talk like that to your colleague at work or your boss. You'd be more natural. Why do you take on this persona when you're selling? Why do you feel you have to go into a kind of, amateur dramatics type act that comes across as that rather than just be yourself? Because you'll come off better than yourself, because so many salespeople sound like they're amateur dramatics that just by sounding naturally, you've already at an advantage.
I think if you analyze sales, it's a conversation, right? Or it should be
Yes.
a conversation.
Yeah.
It's uncovering what the challenges are and the requirements are of your prospective client, and doing that conversationally. We're human beings, right? We buy from people we like and respect, and that we enjoy working with. I mean, that is a fundamental truth. And so, yeah, it should be a conversation. And I think the other thing that is worth thinking about when it comes to salespeople, natural salespeople, and something that the top ones always have, is an inquisitive nature, right? They're inquisitive. They want to know. They naturally ask questions. So it doesn't come across like a Spanish Inquisition with a whole load of scripted questions. It's a natural inquisition. So I go, why do you do it that way? Okay, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that. Have you thought about maybe doing it this way? Or it's a conversation, and it's based around an inquiring mind.
In terms of the actual hiring process of salespeople, so let's call it loosely the interview process, do you think the 80-20 rule can be applied there usefully? Is there something you're looking for in the hiring process that says, I need to filter out some of these people because I know that I'm looking for the better class of salesperson?
I have a very good record, as I think you do too, in terms of hiring good salespeople. Not every one of them has worked, but usually when I've been persuaded to hire someone that I didn't really want to hire, it hasn't gone well. And my interview stuff is pretty casual. I want to understand, I want to like the people that I'm talking to. I really want to understand how they sell. Obviously, I want to understand their performance. And often, if I hear things like, oh, yeah, I hit every quota for the last 10 years, that for me is a red flag, because that seems very unlikely. And it probably means either the quota was always too low, or it's kind of bullshit. And so if people have consistently hit quotas, for instance, then I want to understand how they've done that. What is their process? Because every really good salesperson has a process. They may not call it a process, but they have a process by which they go about, talking to clients, researching clients, prospects, I should say. The way that they work, they have a process. If they don't have a process, then that's another red flag, right?
Yeah.
I want to hear them asking me a lot of questions about the firm, the products, the setup, how we operate, what the team is like. I want them to ask as many questions of me as I am asking of them. If they're not, then how on earth is that going to work when they're out talking to a prospect or a client? What I ask them to do is to sell me a carton of freshly squeezed orange juice for $1. Okay. And I just do a quick role play. I'm a customer. I walk into a shop. This is what I want them to do. I'm not going to give it all away, but the bottom line is my job is to make it very, very, very hard for them to sell me the orange juice. And I'm really good at my job. Okay. And what I'm looking for is how they react to my ridiculous objections that I've got, as long as my arm.
There are people in sales that shouldn't be in it. There's lots of sales jobs, and maybe there are just not enough salespeople in the world to fill all those jobs. I mean, I think that's probably the experience of most people who've been in sales for 35 years. Some people should never have joined the profession. For a small business, or an expanding business where they're going on investor capital, hiring someone like that can be fatal, or certainly damaging. How do you go? What would you give as the biggest warnings to avoid those journeymen, those people who are really in sales for the basic salary and the easy lifestyle, and they get very good at that interview process. They know how to do it because they've done so many interviews. They're good at selling themselves, but they're not going to end up selling your products. How do you yourself try and filter those people out? And what advice do you give to entrepreneurs who may come from a technical background? They've never run sales teams. They haven't got the nose for it. What advice can you give to them to sort of tell them that the person may be a journeyman?
Yeah, I think if you see someone moving around a lot, not always, but sometimes, that is a red flag, right? If they're moving on every year or every 2 years, that can be a red flag, and often that red flag is, well, they've been hired with lots of promise, and then it hasn't really worked out, and they've been moved on.
David Bolden had a lovely expression. Yeah. David Bolden, he said, you can only fail in less than 18 months. Which was fair.
Yeah.
I thought that was fair.
Yeah. And I think, I don't immediately reject those people because
No.
I just want to understand why and how.
Yeah.
But I think if it's repetitive over,
and there's
5,
quite a lot of
6
that, isn't there? You go through
that
LinkedIn
is a
profiles, you
problem.
see that all the time. And
Yes.
I get people, we want to hire this guy, and I look at the LinkedIn profile, it was a year here, 18 months there, a year here, 18 months there, 9 months there, 6 months there. And it's like, this person hasn't succeeded in their last 7 jobs. Now, if it was 18 months, then 4 years, and then 1 year, then a 7-year period, I say, okay, half the jobs they've succeeded at, that's pretty good, actually.
Yes.
And I
because there are lots of things that are outside of their control, right? They could have joined a company that just had an old product or crappy product or
the company. I mean, I've joined companies before where they promised a product, and I've joined on the promise of a product, and they haven't delivered it.
Yes.
And then you've got nothing to sell, and then you've got to leave.
Yes, exactly.
Or it's taken 4 years to deliver a project they said would take, be delivered in 1.
We've all made those mistakes for sure. I've made them too. So I think it comes back to that's the biggest red flag. But I think again, it's about the other thing is it's got to be a cultural fit and it's got to be a right size fit. So if you're a very small company, one of the mistakes I see small companies make quite a lot is they say, okay, I need to hire a salesperson. I want someone who's really got a good LinkedIn network, who's maybe worked for a competitor, maybe a much larger organization than ours. These people will be fantastic. They'll just come along and be able to steal the clients from my big competitor. The problem is often really good salespeople, for a start, are not looking for jobs, okay?
No.
Because they're really good. That's the first thing. But secondly, someone that's come from a really large organization into a small company is usually a very bad move because they are not used to having to put on multiple different hats, do the cold calling, find their own leads, create some of the marketing stuff themselves, all that kind of stuff. They're used to having teams of people doing that work. But I see that mistake a lot. And that's where it's much better to hire someone who doesn't have that network, and you coach them and you train them and you provide them with backup, and they will grow into the role. And I think that's the other thing when you're talking about journeymen. You'll see a lot of these salespeople who are journeyman salespeople have worked at very big companies consistently for a few years. That to me is another red flag.
And I suppose also,
one
thing I've encouraged people before is say, if you were this person you were thinking of hiring in that situation from a big company, why would you want to work for your little company? So I'd ask myself, are you offering them equity in your company? And they've got a situation where if it goes well, they could retire. Then fair enough, that's a good reason. But what are the reasons you would join? Because if there's not good reasons, then why are they joining? They can only be joining for bad reasons.
They're joining because they're slightly desperate.
I've seen a lot of salespeople who know they're going to get fired.
Yeah.
And they're used to that because they've been fired from so many jobs. They get to smell it. They know when it's coming, and they'll jump before they're pushed.
Yeah. I'm relatively forgiving of salespeople when I've hired them. I want them to succeed, and I put in a lot of time and effort to help them succeed. And I think one of the things that I've talked about quite a lot is getting quotas right for salespeople. Because if you go to a company and they've got unrealistic quotas that no one ever achieves, and then that company just blames the salespeople because no one ever hits their quotas, or the sales targets are always being missed by this team, you're getting a false impression that these people aren't any good when actually you set a completely unrealistic expectation. I think once you get into organizations, or once you're talking to salespeople about why they've left or why they've been let go, these sort of things are very important, right?
Absolutely.
To try and tease those out, because sometimes they're good, but they've just been put in an impossible situation.
Yeah, I mean, two things I'll say there very briefly, because I don't want the podcast to go on for too long, but I'd invite comments on this. Is I've seen quotas that are just pulled out of thin air with no basis for justifying them, just like $1 million because it's a nice round number. And I've also seen, this is very common, the guy gets a quota for $1.5 million, and then next year it just gets raised to $2.5 million. No extra resources given. There's no new products. It just gets stuck up because somebody on the board says we've got to put our numbers up, so everyone's quota goes up. It's like, okay, fair enough. I mean, it's a demand of the board. I understand it, but on what basis is that someone done $1.5 million going to do $2.5 million next year? Has the market improved? Has the product improved? Have the case studies you've got been significantly better? But I invite comments on that without going into further detail. But those are the two most common things I've seen.
This is something that I get really exercised about because it happens all the time. It often comes top down with no thought.
Yes.
I joined a business at one point to head up their North American sales, and I was told that the goal for the team was $10 million.
Yeah.
So I was like, okay, fine, $10 million. What was it last year? Well, last year, it was, I don't know, $4 million. I can't remember the exact numbers. And what did the team achieve? Well, $2.5 million. So I said, okay, so what's changed between last year when we hit 2.5 and this year at 10?
Yeah.
Well, nothing. What had changed was the expectations of the shareholders and the analysts and yada, yada, yada had changed. Yeah. And so they wanted to do this. So guess what? It was demotivational in the extreme for every single salesperson, and we missed it by a country mile.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, it was just the most asinine and ridiculous thing to do.
But very common.
So
very common to see. Yeah.
And I've seen it all the time. I mean, that's an extreme, but yes.
Yeah, it's very common to see. Yeah. So let's round it off by talking about commission versus salaried sales. I think it was DEC, wasn't it? The computer company that famously didn't pay commission, only gave salaries. There are whole industries like estate agency and real estate where commission is pretty much the way people get paid. If there are any basics, they're tiny. Brokerage is another famous one, isn't it? New York brokerage. What's your experience on commission versus basics and the motivation of the commission? Let's restrict it to good salespeople, because bad salespeople aren't going to make it anyway. So.
Yeah, I am not a fan of commission only. I think it's unfair on the salesperson because in almost any industry, there's a lot of work that goes into making a sale, and there are other things that are outside of your control. And so there's ramp up time. So you're not able to pay for yourself until you make these sales. Now, on the flip side, reputationally, it can be very bad for the company, right? Because now you've created a series of desperate salespeople who just want to make commission because that's how they live. And that is really not good for your brand. So I'm not a fan of it. And I'm certainly not a fan of it in professional organizations. I think there needs to be a balance. Commission is motivational for every salesperson. When we're talking about good salespeople, they know their worth. They should be paid market rate as base salary, not some low salary and high commission, because they won't come, right? Good salespeople just simply won't come. And then their commission scheme has to be, every salesperson's commission scheme has to be simple, easy to understand, and realistic, right? And then the final thing that is just a general is it should never be capped, in my view. So salespeople, good salespeople, should be able to earn as much as they can possibly earn, because everyone else in the business is going to.
There's something I've never seen it actually capped. What I've seen commonly is someone makes a really big deal, and there's all sorts of wiggle room as to not pay them the actual amount they own, because a deal that size wasn't foreseen. So I've seen that, but I've never seen sales commissions capped. Have you seen them capped?
I have, not recently, but I have. But the thing that you talk about there, I have seen many, many, many times,
Yeah.
and that is, to me, absolutely appalling. But it happens in large companies, and it happens in very small companies too.
Yeah. There's almost a kind of disdain to the idea of paying someone a $500,000 check or
Exactly.
more. Yeah.
Exactly.
And they can always find an excuse. I mean, typically where I've seen it is where a deal comes in that's bigger than they anticipated. There are
Yes.
costs involved in that deal and timeframes that are longer than anticipated. And they do the maths on the back of an envelope and say, we can't afford to pay 11%, or we're not going to pay 11% now for a deal that's going to come out over sort of 5 years. There's no guarantee this salesperson is going to be with us. But on the strict definition of the contract, based on sort of, contracted revenue, they owe the salesperson 600,000, but they end up sort of saying, "Would you settle for 2?" It very much reminds me of the Pied Piper of Hamelin. 1,000 guilders, come take 50. we saw the rats drown at the river's brink. In other words, we've got the deal now, and there's not much you can do about it.
Companies need to, in the same way we talked about with quotas, companies really need to think about their commission schemes.
Yeah.
And in relation to the quotas, the best ones are motivational, have accelerators if you exceed your quotas, and they're just super, super simple, right? The worst ones are where there are all kinds of caveats and it's complicated and you need a Excel spreadsheet to be able to calculate what on earth you're doing and what you're paying and how you're going to earn money. And for one final thing I'll say on commission is it needs to be aligned with the business goals. And what I mean by that is you want to direct behavior that actually helps the business. That sounds really obvious, but you wouldn't.
I've seen that again and again and again, and I've said to them, why, if you want the business to do this, why aren't you rewarding people to do the thing you want the business to do?
Exactly.
You're rewarding them for behaviors that you don't want that behavior. I think we'll end it there for episode 1. Thank you very much for joining us. This commission thing is a thing we could probably produce 3 more podcasts on, and we probably will. So join us again in future episodes. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you.